thank you again for joining us, Mr. Radin. Is it Radin we say?
Radin.
Radin. And may I call you Dean?
Sure.
Thank you, Dean. So I first wanted to tell you how I came across you. I've met somebody from Australia who uses your studies to explain a little bit the intricacies of the mind and how we can actually, by focus, and I know you address that a lot in your latest book, by focus, we can actually achieve incredible things. And so this podcast is called Reclaim Your Mind because I've been a yogi for a long time and I've been studying the Vedic knowledge for a long time as well. And I have realized that without the mind under control or focused, we are just, spread all over the place, not achieving much. So this is the reason why I'm interviewing a lot of wonderful personalities like yourself. So you wrote 6 books, I believe, up to now. Yes.
Yeah, 2 technical books, and 4 popular books.
Yes. And the 4 popular ones I want to mention because they're really wonderful. When I came across your studies, I was amazed, and my husband as well. We've been looking for you, looking at what your work since. So you have for the conscious universe, entangled minds, supernormal, and now the latest one in 2018, real magic. So
right.
These books are very much in line with the studies I've been seeking to understand as well. And so just to start with the background for the people that might not know you yet, you have studied for many decades academia, and what would you say about yourself as a scholar?
Well, my formal training was electrical engineering and psychology, but afterwards I guess I've worked in psychology, but not in engineering, although sort of worked in engineering too. Mm-hmm. My initial career was as a human factors psychologist. This is the kind of psychology that involves studying people at work. So we primarily were studying people and their interactions with computers. So I did that for a while, but I was always interested in studying psychic phenomena. And so I started doing that in my first job, even though it wasn't part of the job. And over the years now, about 35 years, I've managed to work full time as a scientist studying various forms of psychic phenomena. So I've done that at Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, some for the US government, some for industry, and for the past 20 years now at a private institute in Northern California.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So some of your discoveries are really amazing. And not your discoveries, but your studies and phenomena that you have put out there. So can you explain to us in a very simple way, what is the significance of spooky action at a distance?
Well, that's the term that is used in a popular way to describe the idea of non-locality in physics. And it means that from the everyday perspective and also from a classical physics perspective, that if we see 2 objects that are separate from each other and they're sufficiently far apart from each other, then they can't interact. Generally, objects at a distance are thought to be truly independent of each other. But from quantum mechanics, we know that in certain types of preparations of physical objects, photons, electrons, all the way up to larger objects, that even though the 2 things can interact and then separate, they could be at a very far distance, and they are still connected in some way. They still share properties in some way. So the term of spooky action at a distance is referring to this idea that even though the objects are separate, they're somehow still connected. And it was Einstein who used that phrase.
Right. Yes. Correct. So being that this is a fact now, since the studies have been done so many times, I wonder why hasn't the entire scientific world shifted to this, from actually to this, instead of their mechanistic paradigm? What do you think
Well,
that would be?
partially it's because for a great deal of science, most of it actually, does not require quantum mechanics in order to do the science. So in the neurosciences, for example, it is assumed that classical physical ideas are sufficient to completely understand the body, the brain, and the mind. It is thought, really up until very recently, that quantum mechanics is only relevant for the world of the extremely small, like electrons and photons, or for the world of extremely fast, or in general, extremes beyond those that matter to human beings. And by the same token, relativity theory makes a similar assumption, except for the world of the very large, like planets and solar systems and things like that. None of this is actually quite true because there are relativistic effects at the human scale, and there are also, like, our GPS systems would not work unless they were adjusted for relativistic effects. And virtually none of our electronics would work if we weren't paying attention to quantum mechanics. So I think it's simply that unless somebody was a physicist and studied what's going on in the quantum world, they wouldn't have much reason to worry about things like non-locality.
Interesting, because I would think that it's such an interesting point to understand that there is much more to it than what we can see, and it's been proven now scientifically, so that everybody would consider it or at least be curious about it. I'm extremely curious. So you also did something about intuition and precognition with the pictures that flashed on a screen. I've heard about that study. I heard you speak about it quite a few hours. So in a simple way, how would you describe that experiment? Tell us a little bit about that, and what were your conclusions?
Well, many people have had the experience of riding in their car in a certain direction, certain location, and they've done that same route many, many times. So imagine then one day they're riding along and they come to a stop sign or a stop light, and the stoplight shows that they have a green light, so they should just keep going. But as they approach the green light, they get a bad feeling about it. So they just slow down because they feel something is wrong. And as they just approach the intersection, somebody blasts through the red light crossways, and they realize at that point that if they didn't get that bad feeling and slowed down, they would have been hit. So I've heard this kind of story many times, and there are many others like that, where people get a feeling about something and then just pay more attention. So the experiment that I call a presentiment experiment, which means pre-feeling, was designed to try to mimic that sort of real life effect, but in the laboratory. So you can't put people at danger in the lab, but what you can do is you can simulate an emotional effect by showing an emotional picture, or playing a loud sound, or even an electrical shock, or something that's big. And then so you would have a series then of stimuli, some of which would be like calm pictures and some are emotional pictures, and they're randomized so nobody knows what sequence they'll be in. And you record the person's physiology continually, their skin conductance or heart rate or whatever. And then you show them the sequence of pictures. And later you go back and look at the data to see how was their body responding before the picture showed up, even though nobody knew. And so when you do that kind of analysis, and you find that people's bodies remain calm before a calm picture, but they begin to become emotional before the emotional picture arrives. And so that's a laboratory analog of what we hear stories about in the real world.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I heard there are many classes or talks that you explain that further, and I would recommend everybody to look into it because it's fascinating. So a little bit of a speculative thing, but you mentioned in some of your work that you think consciousness has been removed from academia and the scientific process in a way, or that's what came across at one point. Why do you think that happened? And if so, do you have any idea of a timeline? When did consciousness per se was removed from the scientific realm in the past? I mean, maybe it's a century ago. What do you think?
Well, I think it was considered a topic, but primarily by philosophers interested in the mind-body relationship. And it wasn't probably until the beginning of the 20th century that, or maybe a little before that, where scientists started to wonder about this problem of how is it that awareness arises at all in a physical system. So we assume that the brain is giving rise to awareness. That's still the dogma in the neurosciences, because we don't know where else to look for it, right? So early on, many people were saying, especially in the rise of what is now known as behaviorism, the branch of psychology that assumed that the only thing you could actually study was behavior. You could study what you could see. Well, you couldn't study, except in introspective ways, you couldn't objectively study consciousness. So it was assumed, okay, well, that's not scientific. So we won't study that. And that slowly evolved into an understanding that it's not only that you can't study it, but it doesn't exist. So that was primarily the way that psychologists thought about consciousness for about 50 years. And it only became re-evoked as a topic of study only about 30 to 40 years ago, partially as a result of research on meditation, partially as a result of research on psychedelics at the time, where suddenly people began to realize that actually there really is subjective experience, and there's all kinds of different varieties of it that are quite interesting. So we're still at the early stages of having science address these kinds of issues, except for the discipline that I've been studying, which is about psychic phenomena, because that's all about the nature of consciousness. And science can study it. It's just that it's not considered a mainstream topic yet.
Sure. Yet, I like that you say yet, because I'm hoping it will soon. Yes, another question I have, and I took so many notes, I hope you have enough time. Why do you think or feel that this scientific, studies, and what do you think, how do you feel, that this will be brought back into mainstream? Why do you feel that is? Being that we are talking about feeling, I feel that it's long overdue, but you mentioned that you think it will be coming back into the mainstream consciousness and the consideration. Do you think it's not possible that it's going to be continuously just pushed, the scientific methods of just the brain being only a machine, and that we are just beings of matter, and that consciousness is just a mystery that we don't uncover? Do you think it will be coming back into mainstream?
In science follows fads and fashions, just like in the fashion industry. So sometimes there are things that become popular and things that go away, and you can see cycles in history. So in the 1960s and 70s, this was quite popular. And so there's a lot more people and money and funding associated with these. And then it went away, and now it's coming back. So while I don't think the cycle is exactly up and down the same way, it's more like moving up. They're like cyclic ideas. And so the difference now between interest in this topic and the way it was in the 60s and 70s is that the science that we can apply, the methods that we can apply are much better than we had back then. And it offers new ways of understanding what's going on. So what you can see now as a trend in the scientific world is an increase in open discussion about what's called post-materialism. So we don't know what to call it after it's materialism, but so the word post-materialism is used as a way of indicating that we recognize that there are some aspects of reality which simply do not fit the materialistic idea. One of which is consciousness, and others are things like psychic experience and mystical experience and psychedelic experience. There's more and more, we can say, anomalies that are revolving around, like on the outside of what materialism can account for. And as a result, there are more and more academics who are, first of all, they're younger, so that they're not tied into old fads. And like everyone has always been interested in these things, but it wasn't acceptable to talk about. So one of the values then of having new people come along is that they are more open to discussing things that may have been taboo in the past.
Wonderful.
So we're seeing this more and more and all throughout academia.
Yes, yes. It's an interesting thing because I've done meditation since I was 15 years old. I grew up in Brazil, and it was a very interesting experience because it really immediately changed my perception. Already that I come from, a family in Brazil. My great grandmother was a shaman, but she was a little bit like a strange person, a strange character in town, but she was very mystical. So she would, even cure us of certain, mild diseases just by making us think otherwise as children, and some teas and herbalism that we'll talk about. And it was very efficient. And so, but meditation is what actually brought me into saying, yes, definitely, we are more than just this machine walking around, desiring things. So you did also do some things about random numbers with the generators. How does that work briefly? And most importantly for me is what is the function, if there is a reason for greater coherence with greater focus? Meaning, how come there is more coherence in the consciousness, maybe let's say the world consciousness, when there is a focus? How does that work, would you please?
Well, one way of talking about it is that this is about the mystery of mind and matter. Is there an interaction? Does mind just emerge out of matter somehow? So the way that's been studied in the laboratory is to start with the working assumption that mind and matter are deeply related to each other. They're correlated, but they're not exactly the same. So the metaphor that's useful to use is a coin. So just like the two sides of a coin are tightly correlated, they're not the same, but they're inextricably connected to each other. So maybe that's how mind and matter are. They're related to each other in a very deep way, but they're not the same thing. And mind has its own capabilities, and matter has its own capabilities, but they're going to be tightly correlated. So in the laboratory then, what you can do is we use a device called a random number generator, which just produces zeros and ones in a truly random way. And you assign somebody a task to think about or send their intention towards that generator. And that's an experiment on intention. So it's looking at whether your intention, the mind part, can probabilistically influence a physical system. So why do we use random events? Random events because if you go down into the device and you figure out what is it that causes a 1 or a 0 to come out, you can trace it all the way down to the behavior of electrons. So electrons are pretty small things, and it doesn't take much force to push an electron around. So even though it may not involve force ultimately, just the idea that you have something which is like it's balanced on a very, very precise balance, and you can just push a little bit and it'll flop in one direction versus the other. So it is then thought, then, well, if the mind has some kind of an intentional push, they might be able to probabilistically cause it to lean in one direction or the other. So those are 50 years of experiment using intention. And the evidence is pretty clear that intention does influence the behavior of electrons ultimately. So this other category, though, is experiments that are looking at attention. So it's you need attention in order to direct intention, but you could have attention without intention. Like in a meditative state, you can just be pure awareness without having any kind of intentional push. So experiments began to see what is happening with the randomness when minds, one or many minds, became very coherent in the sense that they were all attending to the same thing at the same time. And so what was found is that the behavior of the random generator also became coherent, which makes sense again if you think of each person as like one coin with a mind-matter connection. Well, we have a whole bunch of coins, and they all start attending and pointing in the same direction. There's physical coherence, and coins have aligned, but because of that alignment, it means that and because of the correlation between mind and matter, if a whole bunch of minds become aligned, then matter has to be aligned too. And the way we see that is by the change in the output of these random number generators. They become less random and more coherent. So these are easy to, the change in the output of the random generator is very easy to detect. So it becomes an easy experiment to run, and it's been run now for also almost 50 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. These things are amazing, amazing. You mentioned on your Real Magic book, you mentioned that, or you talked about in some of your explanation and what you've been exploring lately, you said that alchemy became chemistry, astrology became astronomy, and herbalism became pharmacology. So any insight into when, how this happened and how this took place?
Well, they took place during the period in history called the Enlightenment. So roughly, depending on where you want to draw the line, maybe the 15th to the 17th century or 16th to the 18th, something like that. So it was partially because of the rise of scientific methods that, to just take one example, something like astronomy, for example, Galileo was just as interested in astrology as he was in astronomy. But because he was using new methods like mathematics and use of telescopes and so on, he was able to discover more about the nature of the stars than what was known in astrology. So the astrological part of it slowly became dropped, at least by science. It has never been dropped by the public, but dropped by science because for the same reason why consciousness was dropped. Like, how do you study that? Where is it? You know, where science requires you have objective measurements. And so for something like astrology, besides being difficult to study the nature of the symbolism involved in it, the other problem is that some aspects of astrology and herbalism and alchemy are really based on symbolism. It's a symbolic, magical concept.
Absolutely. Yes, yes.
Well, so those concepts don't fit in very well with science because, again, science requires both objective measurement and a plausible explanation. So in astrology, still today, many scientists don't accept it because it doesn't seem to have any plausible explanation. And the same is true with herbalism, although, as we now know, a lot of drugs ultimately do come out of herbs. But the herbalism we're talking about is more like magical practice. Like the consciousness and the herbs are related to each other in some way. But without a plausible mechanism or explanation, then it's people don't think about it. The same is true with alchemy.
Right, right. Until they experience it, because there is a huge trend now, and I'm sure you have heard about with ayahuasca and the ancient medicines that have been used for the indigenous cures forever. And a lot of people in the West are now experiencing it, and there's so many testimonies that are quite incredible. And I believe that growing up in Brazil as well, because there was background in my family that we all been mostly in herbal, very, very little pharmaceuticals at all times. So I wanted to share with you, because I thought this ties up with a lot of things that I've been studying with the Vedic tradition. And now that I'm here in Yucatan Peninsula, where the Mayans still exist, beautiful people, indigenous language is still being spoken. And in this worldview, the Mayan, and it ties to the Vedic as well, which I thought fascinating. I just got here 2 years ago. The Mayans, they view the world as a cyclical thing, as the Vedic as well, and the ancient wisdom from India. So previous ages being actually more advanced in natural abilities, actually. So there is the golden age, and apparently now we are in Kali Yuga, which is the Iron Age, and then we will go back to the golden age, which is, in a way, your intuition is right. If we follow that calendar, it will take a long time, but we are going back into the golden age, which means it's going to get better. So what do you think about that this calendar and the way they live and they see the material world, as they call, as a cyclical thing, is that we develop consciousness and then we kind of lose a little and then we develop again, and it's due to time?
Well, it's at this point, it's part of mythology in terms of what happens during the different ages. What's not part of mythology is the precession of our solar system around the galaxy. So that is a real thing. It takes a certain amount of time for that to happen. So it is roughly related then to these very long cycles of time. And maybe, for all we know, there are differences in the space. Like our solar system will come into a different area of space where suddenly everything is quite different on Earth, because we know something about cosmology and the galaxy, but we don't, when you think about what we don't know, it's mostly what we don't know. We know bits and pieces. So especially given that with dark matter and energy, the visible universe is only about 6%. So we're making all of our assumptions about how things work based on 6% that we can see. Well, maybe in the remaining 94%, there are many more surprises in store. And so maybe these ancient ideas came about because people noticed over tens of thousands of years that there were different ages or epochs that the entire, not only the world, but the solar system would go through that would last a long time. Maybe they're related to to major changes in the weather, the climate, and so on. So I wouldn't be too surprised if it turns out that someday we learn that is actually true.
That is right. Yeah, that I'm thinking that it's important to explore these ideas, because even in archaeology, and I've interviewed, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Mr. Michael Cremo, who has studied and researcher, independent researcher like yourself. And he has come, and there are many archaeologists that have found humans and antiquity, and even if we just mention Egypt, where it's practically unexplainable how things actually got done if we follow the idea that we were from caves and we just progressed naturally like that, or coming from monkeys. So that the anatomically modern, I took note because these words are difficult for me. Anatomically modern humans have existed for millions of years. and it's in a book called Hidden Archaeology. It's a brilliant book, and there is actually, like yourself, because you like to use scientific proofs for studying these things, it's a fact. It's not that, we are talking about, just thinking. Is by observing and discoveries of many, many things that have proven that humans as we are today existed millions of years ago. So it must be that there is a cycle there where we don't have the evolution as explained by Darwin. What do you think about that?
Well, all theories are provisional. And so when we're taught about theories, when we go through college, the provisional nature of the theory is usually not emphasized. It's emphasized that this is what the book says and this is what it is. But we all know that textbooks are revised every couple of years because we learn new things. And so we should not be surprised that even things that we thought we really understood completely, they're probably a special case, right? So the example that I know the best is in physics. At the turn of the 20th century, most physicists thought that physics was finished. They thought they understood everything that was knowable in physics. And then, of course, over the next 20 years, at the beginning of the 20th century, it completely and radically changed. And you see this trend again and again all throughout science. People think they finally get it. We understand what's going on, and something comes along and they recognize then that what they knew before is not incorrect, but it's a special case. It only applies to this particular domain. So it's as though here's our theory, it's correct. Oh, actually, we live in a more comprehensive world when you look at it in a wider stance and more. So that's what's happening to all of our theories. They're simply becoming more comprehensive as we realize that they only apply to certain aspects of reality.
Yes, wonderful. So when you talk about consciousness, how would you define consciousness in comparison or not comparison to the mind? Do you feel that the mind, because I'll tell you why I'm asking this question, because I think it would be interesting that you know what's in my mind. In the Vedic tradition, we say that it is said that the mind is actually part of your body that is connected to your senses. So the job of the mind is just to attend to your five senses. So when your mind will decide what I'm going to eat, and the mind is actually occupied with that. And then consciousness is something else. So it is said there's a mind, and then consciousness is beyond the mind, is who part of who you really are in your whole being. So the difference for me, but I wanted to hear from you. What do you think? Is that a good assumption, or do you feel differently? Is the mind part of the consciousness but not it? What do you think?
Yes. So the brain is a physical organ, which is part of the machine made of meat. The mind is the operation of the brain. But consciousness is awareness, which may have nothing to do with brain or mind. It is an aspect, I think, that is part of the fabric of reality itself. So it's not emerging out of anything. It's simply there. And this is not satisfying from a scientific perspective, because scientists want to know what makes things happen. And in this case, where I'm saying that consciousness appears to be something that is not happening. It is not emerging out of anything.
It's
it is simply
existing, maybe.
Part of the nature of reality. So there has to be a deep relationship between mind and consciousness, because we are conscious. From a mainstream neuroscience perspective, brain and mind give rise to awareness. From a Vedic or just an idealistic perspective, from philosophy, the brain and the mind are tightly correlated, because one actually does emerge out of the other. One's a function of the brain. And consciousness is then tightly correlated with the mind, because the mind as a function in physical reality is going to be correlated with the fabric of reality itself, right? So this is why a lot of scientists are beginning to pay more attention to the idea of panpsychism. Because panpsychism is the notion that everything ultimately has awareness in it, because that's essentially what it's made out of. Or it's not quite that. It's not that the physical world is made out of consciousness, although that would be an idealistic perspective, but more that almost along the lines of thinking of reality as a tapestry. So the tapestry involves materials, but in order to form the tapestry, it also involves consciousness as part of the weave. So it's inextricable. It's part of the nature of reality itself.
Wonderful, wonderful. I had a bee on me, so I got a little. No, but it's okay. They're very happy here, and I just have to push it away. I don't know. So if we talk about, when we talk about consciousness, so there's the what we call the collective consciousness, and then the individual consciousness. How would you explain that? How did you understood that, and why is it that so many people keep propagating the idea that individuals, that the way you feel is non-different than the way other people feel? It's like it's an interesting question. It's a hard question to ask, but it's the collective consciousness is very powerful, like you already said, in the focus. But do we get swamped sometimes by the collective, or is the focus what we have to maintain at all times to achieve our goals and the things we desire to do, and even for humanity to find a much more peaceful way to be?
So I like a phrase that the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi used when talking about this question. That someone would ask Maharshi, how should we treat other people? And his response was, there are no other people. And what he means is that consciousness appears to be a universal. It's not that it only exists even in living systems. It's simply part of reality. It's in it somehow, everywhere. And it's not even in space or time. It's before space and time. So it's everywhere. It's eternal. We are machines made out of meat. And yet, as slightly more complex systems, we gain self-awareness. So we, like the bee that landed on you, has a consciousness. It may not have self-consciousness, which may require more degree of organization in its mind, but we do have that. So we very easily then begin to identify with the body. And so our feelings of separateness is not based on our awareness, but based on the idea that we need to move our bodies around, and we are separate, and it takes time for us to get from here to there, and all of the other constraints that are imposed on us by being embodied in a physical system. But as you know, through meditation and psychedelics and other methods, their sense of awareness can expand beyond the body. And so in the full expansion is what mystics talk about. They talk about universal consciousness. They become one with the whole thing. This is why in Hinduism, it's the idea of Atman equals Brahman. Your consciousness is identical to the consciousness of all creation. So from an everyday perspective, this sounds crazy because we walk around inside our heads. We walk around and we're pulled constantly back inside. And from an organism point of view, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because otherwise your body's not going to live for very long if you're not paying attention. So the physical world has its own laws and constraints, and it interacts in a very deep and intimate way with the nature of consciousness, which is everywhere, always.
Yes, wonderful. Very well put. It's an interesting thing to hear you say in an embodied, because to be embodied, it could mean, and it can mean that you are something else that got embodied. So what would you, if you do have understanding, what would be the soul, if because since you mentioned Maharishi, and he is the one that I first did meditations with in very early on in Brazil, from that line, transcendental meditation, and I really explored that since today. Is it the body a vehicle to higher consciousness? Because that's the individual. So when you say we are walking around our heads and we have to attend to the body, it's true, because if not, we are individuals after all. But what are we embodying is the question. Because in the traditions we say we are the soul.
Yeah.
But
so
is even more, more far out for science, because then you can't really see it.
I have no idea what the soul is. I don't even like to use that term, because when you ask people what it means, everybody you ask, you get a slightly different answer.
Yeah, or energy, or the being.
So I would say then that if you look at the phenomena of something like telepathy, in telepathy, there's a shared mind. It may not persist for very long, but that's the nature of the experience, that it's not your mind and their mind. There's a sharing of mind. That says that what we individually think of as ourselves is kind of an illusion. It's a very powerful illusion, but nevertheless, it is, and it's continually reinforced that we are separate creatures. But all of the psychic phenomena, all of them, are telling us in a different way that you are only partially here, right? You're here because this is like a lightning rod that's pulling you down into this particular form. But the you, the ultimate you, and you can chop it up into many different forms. It's you, your memory, you, your experience, you, your senses, and then an awareness you. That piece, that awareness piece, apparently is not just you. It's everyone. That's why Ramana Maharshi would say, well, there are no others. At your core level, you're really not that separate. And again, from an everyday perspective, this doesn't sound even possible, because that's not the way that we behave as individuals. But there are no individuals at the level of consciousness. It's just one thing.
Right. But I understand what you mean. But do you think that we can be conscious, part of a higher consciousness, but also be individuals, meaning I can feel, because of my machine, the machine I am in, it's much more powerful than what we know. And this you express about in your book, Real Magic, again. There is so much more, that I can be unique and I can be me, this unique individual, eternally, but be so powerful and connected to everything else and the universe in itself that we can't yet understand. That there is one and different, that I can be one with everything and different because I'm unique.
Well, I don't know. I mean, who knows? But the metaphor that's often used is something like a crest of a wave in the ocean. So from a distance, it looks like a separate thing. It's clearly part of the ocean, and eventually it relaxes back into the ocean. It is the ocean, right? It's just a form that arises. So is that crest of the wave a separate thing? My guess is no, it's actually not. Momentarily, it looks like it is, but it actually isn't. And so this is why I have a trouble with the concept of soul. Like you have a special, separate thing from this universal, because even just from a logical perspective, if you're talking about a universal, holistic something, there are no separate things. There's only the illusion of separate things. And the illusion can persist. True. It can persist as the body. It might even persist as some localized mind, like disembodied mind. Maybe that's what a ghost is. Right. But that is a temporary thing that persists mainly as an illusion.
Wonderful, wonderful. There's in the deeper studies of the Upanishads, there is such an idea of equal consciousness, or what they call the jiva, that could be translated as the soul, but it's really like your being, your identity, your eternal identity. It's one and different. That actually, it's called Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva, and it's a very difficult concept, and I haven't grasped it yet. But the idea is that it is one and different. So there is a oneness. I forget that we have been exploring. Is one, but it's also different, meaning that, and that's when they explain the whole karma, meaning that when you will take responsibility. It's random. Things will happen if you take an action. So action and reaction. So you have responsibility individually to, let's say, the course of your life. You decided to study and to write these books, and there will be a consequence of your actions. You have enlightened and educated, and it's an amazing thing. And so I think that is an important thing when we talk about consciousness, because as we are so much more than what science and we can understand and conceive yet, there's a responsibility of the individual, because yes, and that's why your example is so beautiful, that is like, the wave in the ocean is like, yes, I am a little wave in the amazing ocean. But if I have free will, now the direction I take might cause bigger waves or smaller waves and affect others. So how do you take in that idea of one and different?
Well, I guess we could think of it perhaps as a hierarchy. I mean, in this, we often use hierarchies to describe complex systems because it's difficult for us to grasp the entire thing. So maybe our piece of awareness, the Atman of Hinduism, maybe that's part of a hierarchy. So when we give terms of like higher self, well, that's still part of you, but it's on a slightly higher plane of existence. So one of the reasons I resist those kinds of metaphors, because they're all metaphors, all of our language is metaphors, is primarily because I don't like to collapse into stories as explanations. I like to always remind that stories, which include our theories, are stories. They're ways that we make up a very complicated reality in a way that we can grasp. But my sense is that reality is so much more complex than we can grasp, because the ways we think about things are limited by our language. So the way that somebody who is a native Chinese speaker would think about the nature of reality is very different than a native English speaker or any other language. The language is a constraint. So when I'm asked questions like, well, what do you think? What do you think? What is the soul? What are these things? I have no idea what those things are. I'm completely aware of what the stories are, but I don't know if any of those are correct.
Right. Yes, I think I'm exploring all these things because I feel that in your studies, and especially with you, in your studies where you mentioned that the mind and the focus is very important. So maybe we should explore that a little bit. How do you feel the focus is crucial, and how to apply it? Because, if you don't have control of your mind, and if you just randomly, constantly, day in, day out, just thinking of and going with the flow, as they say sometimes in the New Age movement, what are you going to accomplish? So what is the focus, and how best to achieve it?
Well, it's a little bit like they say that if you don't have a goal in mind, then you're never going to end up anywhere. Right? If you have a goal, then you know where you want to go. Otherwise, you just flit all over the place. So the idea of focusing is about attention training, which meditation is the modern method. And it's simply a matter of, can you attend to one thing long enough to actually work with it? So we know with people who are diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, they can only attend for a matter of seconds for each thing. And when you do that, many studies on multitasking have shown that while you feel you might be able to do 3 or 4 things at the same time, your efficiency at doing that goes way, way down. And so our ability, at least with the minds that we have, are much more efficient when we concentrate on just one thing at a time. And that takes training to do that.
Certainly, certainly. So would you like to leave something with, let's say, I have a child, he's in his 20s, child, he's a man now. That's being a mother for you. Yes, and this younger generation that they are exploring and that they are maybe confused, and at this time of day, especially with the health issues that we are being, we are sharing this consciousness where there's so much stress, and it's very demanding to the mind. What would you recommend to the youngsters to feel a bit uplifted? Because I hear in the news that there's a lot of very stressed and disheartened people thinking, what's the point? It's like it's all going to looks like it's all going bad anyway. So what would you leave with them? What is the most important things you could share with them?
What I found to be useful was a phrase that Joseph Campbell said, the mythologist. So his phrase was to follow your bliss. Find something that you're enthusiastic about and do that. And if you're persistent enough, figure out a way to make a living while you're doing that, because then you'll never work.
Absolutely.
So I did that. I always thought the most interesting thing for me was to study psychic phenomena from a scientific perspective. That would be following my bliss. Turns out to be very difficult because there's just a handful of people around the world who are paid full time to do this. But with persistence and knowing very clearly what the goal was, I managed to be able to do that. So some of it is luck, and some of it is intention, and some of it is being in the right place in the right time. But nevertheless, if you figure out what it is that you're really passionate about, in order to do that, by the way, you have to try a lot of things. So try many, many things. Eventually find something that really it strikes your passion, and to do that. Because even if we do live in a nihilistic universe that is completely pointless, I don't believe that, by the way, but if we did, you would still, your passion will draw you into an existence where you're actually feeling fulfilled because you're following your best passion.
Yes, that's beautiful. Thank you. Yes, I feel the same way, and I practically feel like I've never done a day's work of my life in my life, because I am always doing what I want, and it changes. Like yourself, it's like it's like you did something, and then you got down that road, and then okay, well that I'm gonna go down another road that came from that road. So I think that's most important, because there is so much confusion, I think, especially now under stress. So how would you, just to finalize, stress, because that I think is a very detrimental thing. I mean, I know it's a broad term, but a person who is constant anxiety, believe, if they believed that this world is just, for no purpose at all, how to come out of that? Is it like passion? Is it just letting it go? What would you think from your experience when you came across like difficulties or a hurdle that was maybe bigger than you imagined? How did you overcome, and how would you, if you like to share?
Exercise, meditation, eating well, sleeping well. So these are all like basic health things. They're important too. But then as a result of doing things, some of which you're not going to like and some of which you do like, the ones that you like put enormous amount of intention that you want to continue to do that. And then you're right. At some point you may decide, oh, actually, I like to do the other thing even better. And so you just keep kind of navigating through your life and finding things that are attractive, provided they're still healthy. Because it's also easy, especially for someone who's in a depressed or stressed state, to fall into a hole to escape it. And so drugs are an escape, and lots of things are an escape. And it works okay for a while, but in the long term, it's not very useful. So rather than escaping, you want to find a way to figure out what that passion is, what direction you're interested in. And it could be almost anything, provided it doesn't hurt somebody else.
Exactly.
And then do that.
Right. Yes, the simple things I keep saying, to most people that have, come across my life that has difficulties, is like just going back to nature, back to eating, eat close to the earth. I say, it's the closer you can to products that are very natural, and exercise and keeping healthy, I think friends and family are very important.
Mm-hmm.
Those personalities that you can share your life with.
But also keep in mind that personalities are very different. So I'm a high introvert. And so I don't need to be around other people very much. And this husband. Is probably true. But even like this interaction, this is enough social interaction for me to last for a week. So, and this is true for a lot of scientists, right? We tend to be, we're intellectual and we focus in on what we're interested in. But there are people who are completely different than that. There are others who need some kind of direct contact all the time in order to feel like they're not going to explode. Right. So part of the voyage of discovery is also to take things like psychological tests to find out better and better who you are. Like what? So one of the tests I took. Yeah. And what are your natural tendencies? So I did that when I was in school, where after I got my master's degree, I really didn't know what kind of job I wanted. So it turns out that there's some tests that you can take which match your personality against people in professions who are happy in those professions. And that was a really interesting test to take because it told me that I would be happy in 3 kinds of professions. So one of the number one profession was priest, which was surprising to me because I'm not religious at all.
Amazing.
Okay, priest. But I understood because part of my personality leans towards ideas about mysticism. Like, I get the sense that there's something bigger out there. It's just part of who I am. So priest, yeah, that made sense. The next one was policeman. And so I thought, well, where did that come from? And then I said, okay, that makes sense because I'm interested in social justice. And the third one, except that I'm not really built to be a policeman. I would not be a good policeman. The third one would be, was social science or psychological researcher. So that is what I ended up doing. So that's pretty much what my profession is. That's what my doctorate is in. So that was a very useful exercise. And I was probably about 22 years old at the time to figure out, well, what would appeal to me just based on my mental and physical structure?
Sure.
What would I be good at? And it turned out to be very accurate. Wow. So The two of the three I rejected, although I understood it because I didn't want to do that. But the third made a lot of sense.
Yes, it's very interesting. My son did that as well, and it came out that he was to be an architect, but he turned out to be a musician. So in a way, it's architecture in a sense because he is creating compositions. He's composing things and putting
It's structure of sound rather than structure of material.
Of materials, yes.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Well, I thank you so much for giving me your social slot of time. It's very precious to me. Thank you so much. And yes, I am hoping I'm going to read your book because I haven't had the time yet since I was a little bit under the weather. And yes, it's wonderful. Yes, I'm crazy about all of them. This friend of mine who introduced me to you, his name is George Hello, and he created this, it's called EP7. It's a very wonderful method to focus and to, for high achievers. And he uses one of your studies to make some point. And from there, it was like, he sent me one link and we've been like, addicted to your work for the past 2 months. So that's very, very kind of you to do all this work. And I really pray and hope that you have so much more success in this life and beyond. And that your books just fly off the shelf. I'm going to put all the links I can on this.
Okay.
And thank you so much again. And have a wonderful afternoon where you are. And maybe sometime we'll speak again.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye for now.